Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of you for coming on a Friday afternoon to this webinar, and I hope you can now see well my slides. The plan for today is to briefly go through a series of topics. Basically, I am a professor, an assistant professor in digital humanities, but I focus on museology throughout all my background, so we'll try to merge these two sectors and raise questions and topics that might be interesting in the context of this hackathon for thinking who are we developing apps for, who are we developing digital solutions for, and what are important things that we have learned from the COVID experience and that we can acknowledge in our work now. So today, basically the first part, I will focus on museum digital practice, give a very quick overview. I will then focus a bit more on what happened during the pandemic. We have all lived through it, and we know what how many digital projects have been started by museum in this period. And I will reflect mainly on the challenges and the lessons we have learned from that. And one of the main challenges that I want to stress today is that of sustainability, both technical and human, of the solutions we develop. But you can, of course, interact me in any moment. If you have questions, write them in the chat, and I will try to answer you during my talk. To start with museum digital practices, I'm not sure which are all of your backgrounds, so we start from the traditional definition of museums by ICOM, which has been approved 2 years ago now. In August 22, and it says that a museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. And I want to highlight all these verbs because all these are activities that we can support through digital media in various ways, whether for research purposes. This is the part I won't talk too much about today because I think it goes a bit behind the smart tourism focus of the hackathon, but conserving, interpreting, and exhibiting heritage is all of interest for us. In this case, we also have, when we deal with museums, we also have to acknowledge a very strong attention to the public and to the ethical origins of the collection. Ethics is a very big debate in museums. So I will talk briefly about how we can use digital media to open more to the public and make museums more inclusive and support them in fostering diversity and sustainability. And I will do that by having a quick overview of the various practices that exist in museum work. When we want to work in museum, when I started my PhD, for example, I was asked which of these areas of work I was most interested in. Did I want to become a conservator? Not really my area, so I chose something else. I could be focusing on collection management. That's something that I do a lot and I will talk about later, but also on interpretation, exhibition planning and design, marketing, communication, outreach, and education, all areas in which there is a lot of potential for smart tourism apps to foster engagement with the public. To see this in a very graphic way and briefly, when I talk about digital museology as a discipline, I talk about taking our objects, digitizing them, cataloging them, publishing this data for researchers so that we can do more, whether it is provenance research or visualizations or art historical, archaeological research, and also disseminating the information to the public. As you see, I've chosen an iceberg to represent the areas of work of digital museology because often what we see is the top of the iceberg. We see this part that emerges, the dissemination aspect. When we look at museums, website, when we visit a museum, we see nice apps, we always focus on that. But all the disseminations cannot really work without the digitized objects and the data. So I will stress a lot that for sustainable applications, we need to consider also this work that is unseen but important. And we need, of course, to understand what the public likes and how to include them more. And this is the importance of user-generated content. Very quickly, there is a long history in digital museology research of dealing with these problems. I always like to show this very old set of conference proceedings. They are from 1968, from the Museum on Computer Conference. So if we think digital museums, it sounds as a very old publication, given how fast and how much the digital sector has evolved since then. But if we look at the table of contents of these proceedings, we see that there were the same concern we have now with digitizations and cataloging, how to input data, how to work with computer as a system for cataloging objects, which type of analysis could we do with computers, which type of visual application for presenting collections, and also which type of museum education, so which type of communication methods with the public we could exploit the computers for. I just showed that to show the longer tail of museum digital practices, because in many cases, digital work has been going on for decades, and we need to deal with the legacy of these systems and the legacies of this data, and that's an important aspect in sustainability. But basically, what I want to emphasize as a process, and it was also in my iceberg, is the importance of reflecting on digitizing and developing metadata for our collections, publishing the collection, and then thinking about the engagement and evaluating it. In terms of digitization, I will show you later a bit more from these projects. I just want to emphasize 3D because this is the digitization method that is most fascinating for us today. And this is a small project I'm doing with university museums of my institution in Graz, in which we are digitizing the Gipsothek, so the collection of copies of classic Greek statuary that the university collected since the 19th centuries, and we used both LiDAR scans and photogrammetry methods to realize these objects. Once we had the 3D models, we thought about how to representing them with data, and here in museums we have a set of standards that are recommended as metadata for our collection catalogs. SIDOC CRM is well known and as the conceptual reference model for cultural heritage. It's also very complicated to use. So there are lightweight application of SIDO like Lido XML, which is the one developed by a working group in ICOM, in the International Council of Museums, that allows us to describe our objects within these standards. And I won't go through all of them, but if you're interested in knowing more about standards for digitization, I'm happy to answer any question later. The advantage of these standards is that they bring us towards some keywords that are very used in digital humanities research as well, such as linked open data, visualizations of various types, or digital art history, digital archaeology, cultural analytics as emerging area in which we develop further these standards and work with them to conduct original research. But the advantage of systematizing through our collection in databases, possibly respecting these standards so that we respect principle of best practices that allows also computer to read our data and do more analysis, so to say. It's interesting for research. It's interesting also for the public. In this case, I just very quickly mentioned the Rijksmuseum. This is a bit because the standard in digital museology. It's very difficult to go out to a conference on museum and digital without hearing a paper about the Rijksmuseum, because they were closed for restorations between 2009 and 2013. And during that period, they digitized the collection. They created an online collection portal called Rijksstudio, which was published online and gave access to very high resolution images, which we could freely download. For each image in the collection, we have these small icons that enable us to like it, create an account in the collection and give it a like, so sort of save the image, but also download it and do with it whatever we want, so that users can print them, can create new pieces of work inspired by the work of art in the Rijksmuseum. And in order to further promote that, because it's sometimes being online is not enough, we also need to demonstrate to people that's important and that's possible, what's possible to do with these collections. The Rijksmuseum launched the Rijksstudio Award. These images come from winners of the past editions, in which designers took, for example, deft ceramic to create contact lenses, or eyes in the portraits in the collection of the museums to create sleeping mask. This is just an example of how the Rijksmuseum has supported the development of online collections, which are open and freely reusable, and these possibilities are further promoted. If Rijksmuseum stands out as a golden standard for many digital museum collections, on the other hand, we have to account also the digital strategies and policies from the European Union. In this case, the European Union, through the support to Europeana, which exists since 2008, has fostered also digitization of collections and has published a new strategy in 2018, which basically moves us from Europeana to the data space for cultural heritage and the European Museum Cloud, or better collaborative Museum Cloud. Both the data space and the Museum Cloud are under development at the moment, but they will become crucial points for sharing collections, data about collections and tools for cultural heritage in the near future. So we can already start to plan our digital activities so to be compatible with what these spaces and these infrastructures are creating and will become. That first part of my talk is about the importance of digitizing, respecting standards and following strategies. On the other hand, there is the public, and that's probably more interesting for the hackathon, thinking about what it means to create an application or a tool that fosters digital engagement. And digital engagement in itself is a word that is very difficult to define. It can mean many different things. I like to use this framework, which was developed almost 10 years ago by Jasper Wiesper and Jim Rickardsson, because this type of aspect, like that of a business canvas, force us to think about what we really want with each digital activity. And I would strongly recommend to use something like that also in our hackathon next weekend, because it will help us to interrogate the product we want to develop and think what is the assets that we want to emphasize from our case studies, which type of audience do we want to reach, and who are the characteristics of this audience. And then we can, from that, breaking down into which type of platform is the most adequate, which type of activities, how do we structure the content, or which content do we select, and build an engagement activity from which we will then try, if we were a museum, rather than a single project, align it with our general goals and values. In terms of example of digital engagement, there are many. I go back to the Rijksmuseums because, again, not only they put an online collections, but when they reopened in 2013, they also launched a museum app that has been widely praised. You see here a screenshot a bit more recent, is a version of 2018 of this app, but essentially the applications allows us to get basic information we need when we visit a museums. So the first question we have on the home screen is whether we are in the museums or at home, because this will send us to different sections of the apps, and the possibility of buying tickets via the app. Then if we are in the museums, we have a map that identifies the position of the most famous artworks and allows us to reach them. For each artworks that has content in the app, we get almost a substitute of a traditional audio guide. We can still listen through it. After all, we all go around with headphones and smartphones, so why not use them as an audio guide rather than renting it in a museum? And sometimes there might be extra content, such as short videos or more text. And there is access to the Rijksstudio, the portal I showed you before, which allows us to bookmark objects also during our visit. So I might be visiting, in my case as a researcher, when I visited there, I found objects that were very interesting for me. So I just bookmarked them through the app. And when I went back home, I logged in my account through the computer screen. I could find all the objects and read in a more slower way all the information I needed. On the other side, I have this photo of children that comes from Twitter. It was shared in 2014 and it went a bit viral in the Digital Museum world at the time because the user posted it with a bit of a critical stance. They were saying these children are staying in front of one of the Rembrandt masterpieces and they're just watching at their phone. So you can imagine the big discussion about the new generations that happened online. However, the teacher of the school groups intervened in the conversation after a while to note that these children were using the phone because they were looking at the app to solve a quiz that the teacher had gave them for the museum visit. So in this case, the app was really a tool to enhance the museum visits and help them to understand better the work of Rembrandt. Similar apps, I just show you a couple of examples that could be interesting. Could be based on similar interactive system through a screen or a touch screen or tablets. This is the case of the London Museum, which reopened to the public in 2018. There was not a lot of spaces, so the findings were kind of grouped in this wall we see here with this set of squares like a battleship kind of map. But then the visitor at the entrance is given a tablet on which they can identify the object through the square system. It's a sort of find your objects, and by clicking on it, they can get more information. So it's another way of substituting having a lot of text in the museum exhibit, especially when there is not so much space, and still giving the possibility of learning more about the objects. Other types of app could be museum bots. I think you will listen from my colleague in another webinar more about that. Those have been present in different formats for a while. I want to mention the Ask Brooklyn app that was launched also in the middle of the 2010s, in which visitors were interacting actually not with bots in this case, but with real humans. There was a team of museum staff that was answering, and it was an experiment in seeing how interacting with a human will change the visit. There is gamification as another trend in museums. You also will have another webinar on that. I just show you as an example the Museum of London, which worked with Minecraft to create free maps of the Great London Fire of the 17th century. Basically the city of London before the fire, during the fire, so when the fire started and how it kind of destroyed a part of town, and after the fire. And Minecraft players could therefore learn about the London fire through Minecraft itself. And then there are touch screens, already mentioned London Museum, that is to learn things. Another example is touch screen that are used also to interact with the visitor in the sense of surveys. This is the Welt Museum, so the ethnographic collection in Vienna, in which there are these short questions about should, for example, the Welt Museum put objects of souvenir art on display. It's a way of fostering participation and also fostering participatory practice, because the visitor can feel like they are taking part to the development of the museum strategy, and they will see the results when they vote on the screen as well. These are just some examples of applications. There are a huge lot. Just to show some other possibility, I showed some example of application done by my students in the digital museology course, mostly as a way of thinking of what can be done also without the budget of the big museums. The first one is an augmented reality app. It's based on 3D scanning or better and mainly photogrammetry actually of objects in a museum. It's an armory. And then using the profile of these objects to identify them from augmented reality app and get further content. This is a quick video game. It was done with the 3D models I showed you in a previous slide when I showed you this example of 3D digitization. Those models were set into a Unity world created by the students. And we have this character that was found through the Unity store. So it actually didn't need to be created from scratch by our students, going around the landscape and finding objects and interacting with them in different ways. And the last one is probably a very easy approach to storytelling that works very well for creating an additional perspective on an object. But that said, since this is the Rainerit Hackathon, I want to recommend to you to have a look before the hackathon also to the Rainerit Digital Hub, where you find all the products and recommendations by the projects. I have not been mentioning them so far, but on the Digital Hub you can find the video game developed by Panayotis and that he will present next week, I think. You can find the toolkit with artificial intelligence application developed by Marco Bertini at the University of Florence, which you will also find hear about next week. and you find a set of resources through webinars, best practices, fact sheets on various topics that can inspire you for the hackathon. If you navigate the Digital Hub, I just show you that there are 2 main top-level areas that could be of interest for you, which are the green one, which is meant for the general visitor to engage with heritage and discover possibilities. So here is where you find the output described in a friendly and general way, or you can visit the shop or the exhibitions themselves. And in the area resources for professionals, you find the documentation on all of that. So if you want to look at it, I suggest you move between these two, for example, by checking out what is there and then going to see how it has been developed and what was the thinking behind it. If you want to interact, there is a forum with a chat that you can be part of. And if you want to interact with the exhibitions, there are also possibilities. But that's the work we have been doing in Rhine-Herit so far, and to which you will contribute through the hackathon. If that's the situation in general, giving you an overview of museums, I want to briefly mention what happened during the pandemic. We know we were all in lockdown, and there has been a lot of talk about the digital turn, and indeed any kind of survey done by museum organization. ICOM is the International Council of Museums, NEMO is the Network of European Museum Organizations, points out to there have been more digital activities. We should still be aware that these are not evenly distributed around the world. The UNESCO report shows very well that museums in rich countries had way more possibilities of turning to digital in comparison to other museums, and that is something we should keep into mind. In my own research, I developed at the time a map of digital museums developed by digital projects developed by museums during the lockdown. It is not at all comprehensive, not it has a statistical reliability, because of course I couldn't collect it all. I was working with research assistant here in Graz, and then there was a form for museums to list their own projects further. But we ended up with a list of around 1,000 projects from 45 countries. So even if not statistically valid, it gives a good overview of what has been happening. And we classify these projects according to a few different categories. And I want to briefly talk about the results of analyzing the projects in there, because they give us food for thought when we think about sustainability of digital projects. In particular, if I think at virtual exhibition and virtual tours, which were 2 categories that I had in my map, I see that museums which had a very long-standing tradition in digitizations and already had an online collection portal could very quickly repurpose it and develop projects on top of it, such as thematic exhibitions. On the other hand, the museums who didn't have this work, so who hadn't worked on digitization and cataloging before, were struggling a lot more in taking part in this type of initiatives. Many museums also used a lot more 3D. We know that photogrammetry has become much more accessible over the last 10-15 years. And during the pandemic, it was a moment in which many museums started to deal with that, or with technologies like Matterport, to create these virtual exhibitions. But overall, even if we go behind my map and we look at the ICOM surveys, we see that only 7% of museums actually started to work in this area. During the lockdown, most of them were continuing pre-existing work. And that's really a matter of having the data available, having digitized objects available, because simply if I'm in lockdown at home, I cannot go to the museums to do a quick photogrammetry of a new object. And that was the problem many museums faced, how to get the digitized images. On the other hand, what was way easier to start for everyone was doing streaming talks on Zoom, like this one, or social media campaign. These were way more accessible to any kind of organizations. And indeed, even looking at the ICOM surveys, we see that almost 90% of the museums were already active on social media. 47% reported same usage as before, 41% increased the usage. But that was something that everyone could do, and there were many challenges, such as the ones of imitating famous work of art with objects we have at home that were taken up by museums. And probably you have seen some of those during 2020. In general, then, if we think about trends during the pandemic, we have this presentation of collection online that was difficultly accessible to people without longer-term digital strategies. We have the shift of a program online on Zoom or similar platforms, and a series of live also on YouTube, for example, that was taken up by more museums. We have a social media that continue to be used and demonstrated to be an established method in museums. Although we can think platforms slightly changed. TikTok has been around from before the pandemic, but actually started to be very popular, especially in Europe during the pandemic itself. And then I won't expand on that, but also there was contemporary collecting as a practice that emerged a lot in this period and poses a different series of problems in regard of the full digitization and catalogization that I've been talking so far. But that's a side problem that I will eventually talk about more if you have any questions later. But in general, if we think about how we move from the pandemic to sustainable digital practices and what the challenge that we have to address now in the sector and that you can address in the hackathon is how do we reconnect the physical and the online world. We were basically online for 2 years and many museums got new audiences because besides having, for example, only the local population could reach population that was abroad, but could also get new audience that was local, but didn't have the possibility of accessing the museum before, like disabilities, for example. People who cannot get out so easily and go to a museum could, for the first time, follow it online. And so this audience still deserves to be involved, still needs to be involved, still needs an online communication channel. But the question is how to do it when we also have to cater for everyone who is coming back physically, and there is limited forces after all for managing all these projects. At the same time, as I mentioned when showing you the range of projects, many museums turned to streaming tools, social media platforms, and so on. But these are devices and platforms that are geared towards prioritizing participation, but they don't really immediately allow a long-term relationship in the sense of also sustainability of those outputs. Social media, we know that they die sometimes. We have seen Twitter in the last year, for example, and so investing a lot only on Twitter without, for example, sharing the content, also some platform that can be better controlled by the museums was a problem. And this leads to think about how to distribute our assets, so to have, yes, commercial platform that allows us to reach more audience, maybe because they're very popular, but also keep a record of that and keep the possibility of reusing the digitized content or the information for further projects in case the platform goes down. And then, of course, we need to consider the size of the museums. It's mostly a matter of the case studies we will have in the hackathon to think about what are we really dealing with in museums, but also in smart tourism. We can think of a place and the area we want to engage with. And crucially, does it work? That's the final question. There is not a lot of benchmarks for understanding digital audiences, and this is something that has been debated for the last 6-7 years. I did my PhD also looking at social media benchmarks for audiences, but we still don't have a clearer criteria for understanding, besides the analytics of the platform, that are not geared towards the type of engagement museums want. And that's a problem that will need to be addressed. And in general, so when I think about my iceberg, there is a bit of a challenge between doing all digitization, cataloging work, platforms that are stable and can guarantee us long-term sustainability versus the short-term activity for engaging the public. And we see that if we look at the technologies used in the pandemic, if I go back to that, Matterport, for example, stands out as for projects in the virtual tools category. And Matterport works very well. It's very easy to work with, but it's also proprietary software. So the question is, on Matterport, we start to charge more for hosting our 3D models, or the technology will become too expensive as a whole, or it will disappear. What will happen to all these 3D assets, and how can we preserve also a copy in a format that is compatible and accessible to other software, and that we can reuse basically, so that we don't have wasted the effort. And this brings me to the last part of this talk, which is that of sustainability. And the one that I invite you to think about when you plan any kind of digital activity for a museum, to consider it. Sustainability is not always necessary. Sometimes it's very nice and fun to do a project that lasts for a few months, and then it might stop working. But we need to be aware of this challenge, and we need to evaluate the pros and cons, because we are spending money and time in building these activities. And so it's worth thinking about what will happen to them in the long term. And besides sustainability, another traditional challenge of museum is that of authenticity. I mention it very quickly only because alongside the sustainability has influenced a couple of documents in digital heritage. Going back to authenticity, the question is always, is a digital reproduction and the original, what's the relationship between those two? It goes back to Walter Benjamin, who was talking about photography, and he mentioned that the reproductions means the presence in time and space and unique existence of an object at a place where it happens to be, which is what he calls aura. That's a discourse that comes back periodically in cultural heritage. On the one hand, we can go through the theoretical route and discuss authenticity, but on the other hand, this could have also very practical implications, because it might mean that when we reproduce something in 3D, for example, we need to know the level of accuracy of this reproduction, so we know the context in which it was set, not only because we want the authentic objects and we want to see Zora and so on, but just because we want to reuse it for research or for engagement, and we want to know where does it come from, which level does it have in details and so on. And this is the way authenticity in a way has been included in the London Charter, which is a document all as well in terms of how much the 3D landscape especially has evolved, but that it's pretty important in digital archaeology and digital heritage. It was written in 2009, and it set up 6 key principles for all our digital reproduction, or better, computer-based visualization of cultural heritage. I won't go into details in them, but basically the key points are being very clear about why a model, a reproduction has been done, for which aim. Was it a research aim, an engagement aim, a conservation one? Because this kind of gives us a clue of how precise, how detailed it is. And then the methods as well as important to be documented. If it is a reconstruction, so partly of it might be a LiDAR scan, but partly of it we have reconstructed how the building was. Let's think at an archaeological site. We might have only some walls standing, and archaeologists might have theories about how it would have looked like. They would have probably proposed a reconstruction in this sense, but they need to document the process of getting to this reconstruction. So the sources used, and the thinking behind it, so that people looking at it in the future will be able to understand where does it come from, basically. Documentation and sustainability are also important in the sense of documenting the technologies used and thinking about the preservation of these visualizations. To go very quickly through that, I use again the example of 3D objects, and if we think at 3D modeling, there is not really a clear standard to use when we create 3D models. The ISO standards officially are X3D and Collada, but I guess that if many of you have done photogrammetry, perhaps with Metashape, you don't necessarily use this format. What we use the most is Pli and Obji, for example. Most of my projects, I tend to do them with these formats. And often I have to convert them for visualizations. If I'm not using Sketchfab, for example, which is a visualization platform for 3D models that accept a lot of different formats, I might have a viewer which requires me to go from my Pli so the model, the standard, the format in which the object was created, to a Free.js or to a Nexus format for being visualized. And we probably, if you've worked with 3D model, you have experience of trying to exchange a file with some colleague. And it's always a question of what is missing, why my software is not opening it, what have they sent me, and so on. And that goes on format, goes on the requirements, like meta shape. Again, if someone sends you a meta shape file, it's not enough. You need also the folders which comes together. And that's something that sometimes people forget to attach in emails, in my experience, or to upload in shared drives. And if you want to actually modify it, often you need also the photos. And the same problem goes for metadata. We don't have a very good way of describing 3D objects through metadata in the way that we have, for example, for catalog objects like SciDoc CRM that I mentioned before. Just to show quickly example, for these are some of the frequent formats in 3D models. They all have slightly different categories. This image comes from a work from the German Institute for Archaeology, which kind of look what's possible with each format. And when we think about metadata and the way they are defined also in the London charters, or the way we can think about metadata in general, descriptive and technical metadata are kind of always a problem. And there have been many attempts to get there. For example, the Virtual Multimodal Museum, which was a project actually led by Cyprus that finished before the pandemic. And in 2017, they had a paper in which they thought about metadata for 3D models. And they think administrative metadata, rights metadata, descriptive and technical, but they didn't go further into details into that. After that, there has been a working group by the Europeana on 3D models preservation, and also that had many recommendations, but not, let's say, a clear standard to be used. The hope is that with new platforms being developed within the European Union, so the cultural heritage data space and the museum cloud I mentioned before, which are supposed to be hosting 3D models, there will be also step forwards over standardization of the way of describing them. Technical metadata, to give an example, could be not only the software, but also, for example, how many points are there in that point cloud, which is the resolution, and so on. To show you an example of how this could be in practice, I don't go through the list of possible metadata, but I show you how we solved it in the Virtual Gibbs Museum project I showed at the beginning. For that, we use GAMS, which is a humanities asset management system developed by my department, in which we deal on standard RDF and XML based to basically archive for the long term. We are a certified repository with corporate seal, a variety of data from humanities research. In practice, this means that I had a lot of statues from this collection in the Gibbs museums, and my archaeological partner did a lot of tables, which then I converted into XML and better even in the Lido data model, so the model that is recommended by ICOM for museum data. I did that part of the data. I ingested it into our repository and asset management system. And then since these are XML, I could use a technology called the XLT to transform it into HTML, which means to show it. And it ends up that all those data could be shown as simple web pages. For when we had 3D models, we used 3DOP, which is a viewer developed by Impisa, which basically allows us to host it on our website very easily. And we had these viewers. At the same time, we had a bigger tour of the full museum. I show you only the point cloud because that was where we struggled with the size of some of these 3D models. And I created the big virtual tours in which people can click on these yellow dots, which are basically opening up panels describing a bit more selected objects or the rooms on the areas of the museums. But in this way, all this data are saved in a certified repository that guarantees that this will stay there for a while. And I have the XML standard on the back that describe what I did for each object and describe the objects. And I wrote the documentation of the 3D digitizations. But that's part of what's kind of important thinking how to go forward. The last part, I just want to quickly mention that this is the technical sustainability. The other aspect is the people sustainability. So being sure that what we do is relevant and interesting for the public. This is where I mentioned at the beginning, we still don't have a lot of knowledge and understanding of our audiences. I find always kind of chilling perhaps or interesting that Nesta and Arts Council England, so two organizations that have been doing digital culture reports on the English situations since 2013, published the 2019 report in December 19, writing that understanding how to gather, analyze, and interpret audience data is becoming essential. And 2 months later, we were all basically in lockdown, developing a lot of different projects without any clue, basically, whether the public was really liking them or not. So in this sense is where I invite you also to consider evaluation of the product from the beginning of the development phase. There is in museum studies, the visitor studies sector, which deals a lot with this type of question. And there are a lot of different frameworks for physical visitors walking into the museum. In this case, I always like to mention Folk and Dirking because they consider the museum experience as made up from the physical context, how the exhibition is designed, the personal context, what are the characteristics of the visitor, is someone who is already an archaeologist visiting an archaeology museum, or is someone who comes, let's say, from science visiting an archaeological museum, because they probably will need different level of information, or is it a child, for example, and the social context, so the aspect of visiting together. In terms of the social context, we could take, for example, virtual reality as an example, and thinking how virtual reality, by putting on the visor, kind of isolated us. We have our glasses on and we don't see anyone around. That leads us, for example, if we are parents visiting with young children, we cannot really allow ourselves to put on these glasses, have no clue what's going on around, and maybe lose our child in the museum. Or at the same time, again, with virtual reality, being immersed in another reality, it also means that we are not so aware of the physical context around us. So we need to think about how to develop virtual reality solutions that are safe for museum visitors, basically. But what's the way to get there is basically to keep on developing metrics, to keep on evaluating user experiences, for which we can have UX studies that are always very important. We can use analytics, which give us a quick quantitative indication of how well our solution works. We can do bigger visitor studies with questionnaires online or on sites, or various methods that are established in visitor studies. And we can look at the reactions in the press if we do something that gets a lot of popularity, or on social media. But taking on evaluation for any kind of digital solution is always an important part of the all. With that, basically, I'm reaching a conclusion for today. I've tried to talk about the variety of museum practices and emphasize how the first step, digitizing an object, is very important to produce any kind of long-term and sustainable strategy that enables multiple forms of digital engagement. That's, as I argued in the second part, something that we discovered a lot during the pandemic, when we had all these projects, and now we have to deal with their legacy and with how to continue, how to go on. And in this last part, I try to focus on a bit the technical challenge using the example of 3D, and now to emphasize the importance of evaluation. If you want to continue the conversations on the Raineri tab, I mentioned we also have a forum where we try to have regular chats, but where also you can post anytime. And there is the Raineri community that you could engage with. But that aside, for now, I accept any question in the minutes left. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Chiara. This was a really interesting presentation, and I found specifically interesting the part where you talked about sustainability and how we can keep working on these practices after we've created them and maybe for the long run. And I think that's also important for all the participants of this hackathon to have in mind when creating their ideas. And also, I really appreciate the fact that you presented actual projects that went into practice in museums. And I think that would be great information for our participants as well. Thank you. As Kira said, the floor is open for questions. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand and we can ask you to unmute. Panayiotis, yes. I asked to unmute. I don't know if.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was saying that I forgot where to find the raise hand icon, which means this is good. I'm getting out of the pandemic. So, so thank you, Chiara, for the presentation. Just a quick question on the technical thing. So you mentioned there is a lack of standardization in general, like 3D models, etc. So I was wondering what your opinion is if this recent trend for moving into the metaverse or Web 4.0 or whatever is something that might help a bit, in the sense that this might push big companies and big institutions to maybe standardize things. Do you think it's something that could be potentially useful for museums in general?
That's a very good and interesting question. I think I've recently got interested, I mean, not fully metaverse, but like XR a lot. And I'm looking a lot at the neural nerve, basically. And so I think it's really interesting.
Already all the news, nerves are already...
Yeah, no, sorry, and the Gaussian splatter also is the other one that I mean.
Yeah.
I'm getting into that direction, so I would love to talk more about it.
I think so, more very fast.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that would be of much benefit for museums and much interest. I was recently at a fair of technologies for museums, and I mean, yeah, Gaussian splatters were everywhere, basically. There were a lot of providers for those things, but at the same time, I think it's like we are moving to two different speed in a way, because the European Union now with European data space, we lost 3D models, but they will have their own indications. And the European Digital Strategy, which has been published in November 21, has a set of targets for each country to produce 3D models of high quality. And they don't define what this high quality is, which is a problem in itself. But like, for example, all countries are starting from 0 for the EU, and like Austria has to get 400,000 3D models by then. And through all the EU, these are also linked to the COVID funds, basically to the resilience and recovery funds. And each country there is kind of a committee for this cultural heritage data space, and each country is meeting regularly to monitor the reach of these targets. And all these technologies and the metaverse are not yet part of the discussion for them. A lot of it is still about scanners or photogrammetry and talking about how to do it. And I think there is still a lot of issues, like, is it just Sketchfab, which is anyway, probably, yeah, platform better of how to do it. Like, I've been involved from the Austrian Minister of Culture side in the discussion. And yeah, finding the right formats, there is a big discussion. We haven't yet gone into, yeah, those other aspects, metaverse-like, because I think there is not a EU policy that is clear enough to support it. But I don't know if you know anything more recent on that side.
Well, I can comment on the side of, there is a big trend now for digital twins in general, which is basically what we're doing here is digital twins, but for specific artifacts or museums. So there is a big trend there to standardize some things, both in storage of data, metadata. So for 3D models, let's say maybe use GLTF or I don't know, USD for descriptions of scenes, which are becoming like they're being pushed as standards, let's say from companies mostly. So I was wondering if that is leaking into cultural heritage sector or not.
So far, I mean, digital twins has been as a keyword, yes, a lot. Like the current campaign from Europeana, which has been launched this autumn and still ongoing, is called Twin It. And that's for the production of 3D models by cultural heritage institutions. But when I think digital twin, honestly, I tend to think more about BIM and architects, engineers, and they are moving way faster, I think. I've been looking into BIM systems that were recently because I was interested in developing it. But in the museum sector, there is still not that same kind of effort. Coming from Italy, I know that a lot of heritage BIM or historic BIM, as it is called, looking for papers or research is produced by Italian researchers because there is a lot of historical buildings in need of conservation plans. So BIM is an easy solution for a building level. But in terms of standardization, I haven't yet seen anything that's kind of strong enough to be.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks to you.
If anyone else wants to ask anything, not only on the presentation, I'm also here for questions you might have on the next weekend's hackathon. Great. So I think if we don't have any other questions, I'd like to thank you again, Chiara, for this presentation. I'd like to welcome everyone to check out our website. And also, if you haven't yet done it, go to Eventbrite so you can register for next weekend's hackathon. And I hope to see everyone there next weekend. And also remember that we also have 3 more webinars coming up next week. And I hope to see people coming to those webinars as well. Thank you so much. One of which would be of Paraiotis.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice weekend, everyone. See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.